Hey, what's up guys? Rago here from Kite. So recently I had the chance to try two freestyle kites that initially I thought were very similar. The long-standing Cabrinha FX and the newly redesigned Liquid Force Envy V9, which has gone into the crossover freestyle direction. Now, like I said, at first I thought these two kites were very similar. But what I found is, after a couple weeks of testing, these kites are actually very different. All that said, if you're that rider who's looking to progress your unhooked riding or kite loops, you definitely want to be on one of these two kites. The question is, which one is right for you? Let's get to it.
You sound like Zach Morris would Saved by the Bell.
Saved by the bell, it's alright. Hey guys, I know we say it all the time. Don't forget to click that eye icon in the upper right hand corner of your screen. And you can open a new tab with my full comparison of these kites. I'll also include a vlog from Portugal about testing them and a session with Liquid Force rider Christoph Tack. So like always with Versus, let's start with the wind range. So if you look at the two wind charts of these kites, you're going to see that on paper they do have an identical wind range, but it is a little different on the water. And what I found was the new Envy, it really favors the high end of its wind range. It really comes to life when you have a lot of power in that kite. And the FX, while also it performs very well on the high end, it's a gruntier kite. It has just a little more oomph on that low end, whether you're loading or you're riding upwind. But a lot of it is more so the feel of the bar pressure. The Envy has significantly lighter bar pressure than the FX, so some of this is an illusion. And while the FX does feel a little gruntier and kind of seem to have a little more pop on the low end, when it comes to upwind ability, I found there to be no advantage or disadvantage between the two. That said, the Envy does have lighter bar pressure, so at times it feels like you don't have as much power, but back to back, they both ride upwind just as well as each other. Whether I was in the bottom end of the wind range or on some of the days when I was kind of overpowered on these kites, they both ride upwind almost identical. To this point, I will say there's no advantage with upwind ability, and probably a small advantage just when it comes to loading the FX on the low end. So this kind of leads to the next point of the bar pressure and feel. Now, a couple months ago when I first tried the Envy, my first thought was, wow, they've really improved the bar pressure. I'm getting a lot more feedback. You know, it was a more even load between the lines between the V8 and the V9. But compared to the FX, the Envy actually still has very light bar pressure, like significantly lighter than the FX for sure, even on the heavy setting. And as always, whenever I'm kind of getting familiar with a new kite, it usually takes a few sessions to kind of get the timing right, understand the dynamics of the kite, and what I came to realize is with the excessively light bar pressure of the Envy, it almost creates like a sensation of security when trying new tricks. Sometimes when I'm on the other freestyle kites like the FX or the Dice or even the Dash, and you go to load, there's a lot of power there. I mean, that kind of comes with the territory with crossover freestyle kites, is when you go to load, you really load those kites up and you really feel that explosive pop. But the Envy, it's really unique in the sense that when you go to load the kite, it's a very light load and it's still an explosive pop, but it's definitely smoother than the other kites. And yeah, it's almost hard to explain, but this is something that's actually very unique to the Envy, is that unlike the other kites, it has a much smoother feel to it. The load feels smoother, turning the kite feels smoother, everything actually feels smoother. And a lot of that I think comes back to the fact that because of the light bar pressure, you're not getting as much feedback from the kite. And don't get me wrong, this is still a very direct kite, but it's a very light bar pressure, so everything feels less intense. So I actually found myself feeling more confident to try tricks that I hadn't thought about trying in a while. And then when I got back on the FX, it was immediately apparent just how much more feedback you get from that kite when you load it. And you know, it's a more explosive feel, it's a more aggressive feel, and that's something that a lot of you look for in a crossover freestyle kite. That's why we ride these kites, because they have that explosive pop and slack. But what I did like about the Envy was it still had the explosive pop and slack, but it was not nearly as intense as the other kites. And this is a point that I'm actually kind of having a hard time explaining, because, you know, the Envy is still an explosive kite, but it's just a very smooth feeling, a very progressive, almost reminiscent of like riding cable. Ah, there we go. You know, when you go to load the cable and it's very heavy and then you launch and it's excessively light, you kind of have that feather feeling as you're floating in the air. It's very much the same with the Envy, except for you don't have that very heavy load like the other Freestyle kites. It's a very light load, and then it still feels feather light in the air as the kite pops and slacks. Now in contrast, you know, the FX, it has a heavier bar pressure. You know, when you cut upwind, or when you go to load the kite, or just when you're sending it for a jump, everything feels a little more intense. And I wouldn't consider the FX to be a heavy bar pressure kite, but it's definitely a more direct, moderate, kind of has that Cabrinha feel to it. So between the two, the Envy is significantly lighter. And this might be the most important point here, because this light bar pressure actually affects the dynamics of the kite in every way imaginable. And kind of what I've settled on after thinking about this for a while and how this impacts the kite is, you know, the Envy almost inspires confidence to try new things, because all of the other crossover kites have this very heavy, direct loading feel. It's kind of reminiscent of sea kites, whereas the Envy has such a light load, but it maintains that explosive pop that you're looking for. So in a weird way, it almost makes you feel more inspired to try new things, because you don't feel like you're going to get ripped off the water. And we'll come back around to this point in a minute and elaborate on this, but the main takeaway with the bar pressure and the feel is the Envy is very light, very smooth. The FX is very moderate and very damp. So let's talk about hooked in jumping. Now this is one of those points where it's kind of funny, because both of these kites are aimed at the same rod. They're that same kind of crossover freestyle design, but I actually did find them to jump very different. So the FX, it kind of had that very powerful explosive pop even when hooked in, you know, very explosive takeoff, and then not the loftiest kite. And then in contrast, the Envy, it almost felt more free-ridey. I actually thought that it was easier to jump with, probably the same just in regards to hang time in loft. But I didn't think that it quite jumped as high. But that's difficult to quantify, because I have been flying the FX for 3 years now, and I've been flying the Envy for about 3 weeks. So this could be a timing issue on my part, but in my experience, I did find that I got a little more height out of the FX. It just seemed to have a little more explosiveness on the takeoff. And then, you know, in regards to the airtime in loft, obviously both of these kites are not the loftiest kites in either of their respective lineups. You know, the Switchblade or the AV8 is going to have far more loft than the FX. And then likewise over with Liquid Force, you know, the P1's a much loftier kite than the Envy. So moving on, let's talk about stability. Now this is a point that I was actually really surprised. And I say I was surprised because the FX, it has been my go-to kite for a few years. It has that very kind of shock-absorbent, damp Cabrinha feel that I've kind of come to love. But with the Envy, because the bar pressure was so light and everything seemed so smooth with this kite, that even in the gustiest of winds, and I really tested this kite in some pretty awful, cold, punchy conditions at times. And what I found was it was stupid stable. I never really felt like any chatter. It wasn't rocking me in my harness, and all in all, I have to say that the light bar pressure, this really unique Envy feel, there is something to it. Where yeah, on those really punchy days, I actually really enjoyed the Envy. And then conversely, the FX, you know, it takes a different road. It's a damper, kind of more shock absorbent feel in the bar. One has that very damp feel, and then one just has a very light feel, very light, smooth feel. But long story short, both these kites are incredibly stable, and I know some of the older Liquid Force kites didn't always have the best reputation. You know, the pre-2015 Envy, for example, had a lot of chatter. They kind of fixed it in 2015. It got a little better in 2016, likewise in 2017. And I have to say that I am thoroughly impressed with the latest version. The V9, incredibly stable kite. So we're going to mix the format up a little bit this time, and we're going to talk about waves just a little bit earlier. And this was an area where obviously neither one of these kites are wave kites. They're crossover freestyle kites, but the Envy, very much like the Dice, it does have an advantage in the waves. A lot of times I don't really dive into this point because now all the brands have wave kites, and you know, the same is true with both Liquid Force and Cabrinha. They both have their own wave kite. But between these two, the Envy actually works okay in the waves. You know, it's kind of a faster flying kite, and you know, it's actually reminiscent of, similar to the duotone dice in the sense that it's one of those kind of weird crossover kites that actually works pretty decent in the waves. You know, in the FX as well, it will work. Between the two, I would gravitate towards the Envy. I think it's a little faster, kind of has an advantage, and that lighter bar pressure is beneficial. And I'll have to elaborate on this further in the written blog, but end of the day, you're going to have an advantage in the waves with the Envy. Let's talk about kite loops. Now, this is a point that I actually didn't often review, as it wasn't something I did a lot. But after having done an entire kite looping playlist with our team rider, Blake Olson, it's something that I'm actually getting excited about. I've been doing a lot of testing with it, and I had the chance to try these two kites back to back. And what I found was the Envy, it has a very wide, powerful arcing turn. So the kite loops are actually more powerful on the Envy. Where in contrast, the FX is not quite as arcing, so it's a more precise, powerful kite loop. Now, when I say that the Envy is a little more powerful in the kite loop, don't be mistaken, because both of these kites are stupid powerful when it comes to kite loops. And the biggest takeaway that I found on this point is the FX kite loop's a little bit easier because it's a little more precise and tighter in the turning, but the Envy has a more powerful, grunty, wider kite loop to it. So this is completely up to what your preferences are. If you want something a little more precision, a little easier, go for the FX. If you want something super powerful, go for the V9. So alright guys, let's talk about what might be the most important point on these two kites, and that's the unhooked performance of them. And I touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the bar pressure and feel, but what I found was, like I said, initially I thought these kites were very similar, but they're very different in this sense, and this comes back to the bar pressure. So with the FX, it feels a lot like the other crossover freestyle kites, and what I mean is they all seem to have that sea kite-like DNA, where when you unhook and you load the kite, you're directly connected. You feel exactly what you're putting in, and you get a very explosive, rip you off the water pop with these kites. Now the Envy was really unique in the sense that initially I always felt like loading I didn't really have any power because I wasn't getting that surge of bar pressure in the bar before I popped. But once you started popping, it was very smooth, and it's still very explosive. I was able to get just as much height out of the Envy. It just wasn't quite that rip you off the water feel. It was a very, you know, consistent, gradual, smooth feel, which I have to admit that I actually started to like personally. And this is going to be a personal preference. See, if you're that rider who's been riding sea kites forever and you love to just get ripped off the water, you know, you're probably going to prefer any of the other crossover kites. But you're somebody just getting into freestyle, or you're that advanced rider who just wants to try something different, I would encourage you to get your hands on the new V9. It's just really unique in the sense that it's a very light feeling load. When I first got onto crossover kites, it was actually kind of intimidating, just that raw surging power of loading the kite. And when you take that out of the equation, but you maintain that same explosive pop, it's kind of a nice combination as you start to feel inspired to try new things. You get less arm fatigue from the low bar pressure. Now coming back to the FX, when it comes to the loading, you know, there are some advantages to that. Very direct, very connected, very raw, powerful feel. And something that I've come to appreciate about that kite is I always know exactly how much power I'm putting into the kite when I load it. You can really feel those lines load up, and again, this partially comes down to the fact that I put so many years in this kite, but I know exactly how much power I have when I'm loading that kite. So there is a big advantage to a lot of the other crossover kites that they do have that very raw, powerful feel. But this comes down to what appeals most to you. So if you're somebody who wants to get into freestyle, but maybe you're a little intimidated by that raw, explosive power, you know, the Envy, that's a solid choice. That is an excellent freestyle kite. The FX is just a step closer in the sea kite direction. If you're somebody who loves that raw power, it's awesome. But if you're somebody who's new to unhooking, it can actually be very intimidating, just because you do feel like there is a lot of power in the bar when you go to load and do your first freestyle tricks. So this is a subjective thing. You know, you should make your own mind up on this, on what sounds more appealing. So between the two, both of these are awesome kites, but they do take a different approach to the same end. And this year, I'm actually going to make a point to get a little more familiar with the V9. So I just switched up my quiver to a 13.5 and a 10.5 Envy, and I'm going to put more time in over the summer and the winter just kind of riding this kite. Now, as always with Versus videos, there's no right or wrong, it's just what feel appeals best to you. I obviously love the FX, it's been my go-to kite for 3 years. Last year I did spend an entire season on the dice just to get more familiar with it. So if you're trying to decide between these two kites and it comes down to this one point, just go by feel. So the Envy, it's a smoother, more consistent, lighter takeoff, yet still has a very explosive pop. It just won't feel like it's ripping you off the water. The FX is going to have a more traditional feel, very direct feedback, and it's going to rip you off the water. So in summary, after a couple weeks of testing, I found that I really did enjoy the Liquid Force Envy V9, and both of these kites have a significantly different feel. The FX is maybe a step closer to the sea kite direction. The Envy's probably a step closer in the all-around freeride direction, meaning if you want to dabble in the waves, you know, there's an advantage there. But if you're that rider who's looking to do powered kite loops, both of these kites are going to excel there. If you're that rider that wants to unhook, they take a different approach, but both of these kites are an excellent choice. Whether you're a new freestyle rider, you're an advanced wake style rider, you're somebody who wants to get into the kite park, these are the kites that you want to be on. And when it comes down to deciding between the two, well, that choice is on you. Now, as always, Versus, it's an open forum, so if you have any experience on the FX or the Envy, please leave a comment. The whole point of this video is just to accurately describe these kites to help you decide which one is right for you. So if you have been riding these kites, you know, let the other viewers know what your experience has been and help them make that decision as well. This whole Versus series is about getting the most in-depth, objective reviews out there online. So please feel free to contribute and just let us know your thoughts on the kite as well. And don't forget to click that eye icon to read the full written review, catch the full vlog with Liquid Force rider Christoph Tech. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. And if you've already subscribed, click the bell icon so you can get a notification every time we drop a new review, travel guide, or trick tip. So until next time, this has been Rago, and I'll catch you on Versus.